All right, welcome to another episode on the Joel Wright 2 channel. This video is part 3 of a presentation my dad, John Wright, gave to the pilots of the 78th Fighter Squadron at Shaw Air Force Base, South Carolina in October of 1997. He had been invited by the squadron to give an account of his combat experiences during the Korean War in the F-84 and the Vietnam War in the F-105. Now, the portion of his talk where he gives an account of his Korean War experiences in the F-84, I've already published as essentially part 1 of his presentation in this video here. I will put a link to that video below. It's in this part 1 video where I give a little bit more context and background as to why my dad was giving this talk to the 78th Fighter Squadron in the first place. The portion of my dad's talk about his Vietnam War experiences in the F-105 are essentially part 2, which is this video here. Again, I'll put a link down below in the description. This video is essentially part 3 of his presentation where he talks about his participation in the Pueblo Incident, specifically the Air Force's response to that crisis. On January 23, 1968, the USS Pueblo, an electronics and signals intelligence gathering ship, essentially a spy ship, was seized by the North Koreans off the North Korean coast in the Sea of Japan. The North Koreans claimed that the Pueblo was violating their territorial waters. The U.S. claimed that the ship was in international waters when it was seized. When the Pueblo was seized, there were no Navy assets available to immediately respond because, quite astoundingly, there was no contingency plan in place to rescue the Pueblo in case it got into trouble, because the Navy didn't think the Pueblo was going to get into trouble. So it was up to the U.S. Air Force to provide the potential immediate response to the crisis. In the whole Pacific, the only Air Force unit that could respond immediately was the 18th Tactical Fighter Wing at Kadena Air Base, Japan. The wing was an F-105 unit. So at the time the Pueblo was seized, my dad was the Assistant Deputy Commander of Operations for the wing. He was a major. He had been in that job for barely 2 months. He had just been the commander of the 67th Tactical Fighter Squadron, which is one of the constituent fighter squadrons of the 18th at Kadena. He was ordered by the wing commander to put together essentially a task force to scramble all available F-105s to Korea as fast as possible. Now, the initial plan was to try to sink the Pueblo at sea before it got to a North Korean harbor, because the ship was loaded with all kinds of highly classified equipment, but there just wasn't enough time to do that. So the plan B was to sink the Pueblo in Wonsan Harbor. So the following is my dad's account of those first 3 days when he was put in command of the Air Force's response to the Pueblo incident.
I think that the scariest thing that I was involved in was the Pueblo incident. When the USS Pueblo was seized on February the 23rd, 1968, I had 12 F-105s in all of the Pacific. I had the 12. And I wasn't in the squadron command. By that time, I disbanded my squadron. And I was the deputy wing DO as a major. And so they told me to take the 105s to Busan, Korea to save the Pueblo. And I had 13 pilots, 12 105s. And Joe Lawson was in that bunch too. And so Joe and I took off at midnight. And the thing was seized at 11:25. And by midnight, I had all 12 of my 105s. Because, some of them were broken, some of them they were just scattered all over flying. So we had to recall the pilots and everything. And so Joe and I took off, and I broke your, oh, your auto problem. Joe and I took off, and I lost all my electronics. And I had to jettison my fuel tanks over the bay, come back in and land, blacked out. They had gotten another 105 ready, and I just jumped in that 105, took off, picked Joe up, and went to Korea. We got there about 2 in the morning, and we had already, the mission plan was already to send 12 105s into sink the Pueblo. When the sun came up, I briefed the pilots, and I had 13 pilots, and I said, we're going to lose 6 on the way in, we're going to lose 3 as we pop up with the dial-on line, and we're going to lose the last 3 on the way out because we don't have enough fuel to come home. This was a one-way mission. And I said, if one of you can back down, so we only got slower. I said, no questions asked. And this one boy held up his hand, and I said, I don't even know who it was. I said, you're it? He said, no, sir. He said, we've got a 2-seat F-105. Can I go in the back seat? Boy, does that make you proud of the United States Air Force. The Pueblo was in Monson Harbor. There were, the intel officer got up, he was a brand new second lieutenant, first, actually, yeah, he's a second lieutenant. And he must have seen a lot of World War II movies, because he did everything an intelligence officer was supposed to do. And first thing he did is, now I are one, huh? The first thing he did is he said, "You're opposed by 360 million. And I said, "Whoops, just a minute." I said, "That's about right, isn't it, gang?" They said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Fine, keep going." And I divided 12 into 360 million. So then he said, "There's 10,000 anti-aircraft guns and missiles waiting for you." I said, "Can't do anything about that." I said, "We're not coming home anyway." And so then the Navy got up and they said, "We want you to leave and go out over the ocean and come in from the ocean." I said, "Can't do it." And they said, "Well," he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because I don't have enough fuel." And he said, "Well, that's what we want." And I said, "I know what you want. You want it to look like a Navy show." The Navy had no carriers to do this, to sink their own ship. I said, "Forget it." And I called General McKee and told General McKee what was the matter. And McKee said, "Do what you want to do." So I told the Navy guy to take a flying leap. And the Navy guy got up and he said, "You're going to sink the Pueblo." And I said, "How can you get a Pueblo to float? It's one of those Indian villages, and, how they get in?" And he kind of upset me. And he said, "It's a ship." And I said, "Well, how do I know what it looks like?" He said, "Did you see Mr. Roberts?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Same ship." They converted it to an intelligence ship. I said, "Okay." I said, "Is the crew on board?" And he said, "Yes, they are. More than likely on board." And I said, "We're going to kill all the crew." I said, "Don't put my name in the history books." And he said, "Don't put my name." So Navy didn't want my name in the history books either. So anyway, we went out to the airplanes, got in. It was 23 below zero. The wind was blowing, snowing. They knew we were coming, but we wouldn't have been there if we weren't. And they put heaters, they put the big ground heaters going on us. Johnson waited all day, called it off that night. We went to the cockpit the next day. By this time, the MiG force had gotten bigger because they were flying in Chinese MiGs like crazy. And we waited all day, again, 23 below zero. Johnson called it off the second day. Third day, we started getting 105s in. And at that point, I lost command because they brought in a full crew. And I lost command on the third day. But at least I had command in the first 3 days. And that was a very historic 3 days.
So the orders to sink the Pueblo obviously never came down, because if they had, my dad's strike force of 12 F-105s would have most certainly been wiped out, and it would have most certainly have triggered a major Second Korean War. When the ship was seized, President Lyndon Johnson was presented with a range of military options. As a response, he ultimately rejected all of those and instead opted for a mix of diplomacy and a massive show of force. The show of force was deploying about 360 Air Force aircraft into the Korean Peninsula, and the diplomacy was direct negotiations with the North Koreans on trying to get the crew back. So as a result, my dad essentially sat alert at Osan Air Base for the entirety of 1968 in his F-105, just in case those orders came through to sink the Pueblo. My dad mentions a couple of people in this video, the first being Lieutenant General Seth McKee. McKee was the 5th Air Force commander at the time. 5th Air Force during this time in 1968 was the command and control element for Air Force units throughout Japan and Korea. So during these 3 days, General McKee was basically my dad's direct commander. McKee would eventually make 4-star general, and his last duty was the commander of the North American Air Defense Command, and he ended up passing away in 2016 at the age of 100. The other individual my dad mentions is First Lieutenant Joe Ralston, his wingman, when he and Ralston scrambled out of Kadena to go to Osan. Ralston later became a 4-star general, his last duty being the Supreme Allied Commander for NATO forces, and he retired in 2003. So what happened to the crew of the Pueblo? Well, there were 83 members of the crew, one of whom was killed during the initial seizure by North Korean forces. So the other 82 members of the crew were taken into captivity, were treated very badly, and spent most of 1968 in captivity while negotiations dragged out. They were finally released 2 days before Christmas, 1968. So whatever happened to USS Pueblo? It's actually still a commissioned Navy vessel, because as we speak, it is sitting in the North Korean capital of Pyongyang as a museum ship. All right, that concludes this video. I hope you found it interesting. Thank you so much.